right, good evening, everyone. We will be starting momentarily. Thank you all for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes until everyone gets in from the waiting room. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We're just going to give it another few seconds. We're just going to wait for the waiting room to empty. Looks like we're just about there. I think we'll have a few more folks join us. All right, so we will get started. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. Just as an icebreaker, no obligation, no pressure, but if you feel comfortable doing so, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from tonight. So feel free to type in the city or town that you're watching this from. Okay, and as those start to come in, we will get started momentarily. I am recording tonight's presentation. We are in webinar mode, so you don't have to worry about the camera picking up your video. It's only going to be focused on Brenna and her presentation. So want to thank the libraries working towards Social Justice Collaborative for partnering with Tewksbury for tonight's program. And specifically, I want to thank the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. And I also want to thank the, who's my Wayland, is it, I'm going to get this right, my Wayland Free Public Library in Wayland. Wonderful. And I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for their financial contribution. So everyone is going to remain muted during the presentation. If you have any comments for Brenna, you're going to type them into the chat. If you have any questions for Brenna, you're going to type them into the Q&A, and we will get to those both at the very end of the presentation. To set your expectations, I anticipate the program lasting approximately an hour. Brenna will speak for 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll take 10 or so minutes of questions. Everyone will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to this recording in case you want to share it with anyone. And there'll also be a link to a feedback survey. Let me know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events at the Tewksbury Library. And I will also share those survey results with North Andover and Wayland. All right, bear with me one second. All right, let's get to the good stuff here. So tonight's presentation is entitled The Power of Protest Images in the Black Freedom Struggle. Join Dr. Brenna Greer, professor at Wellesley College, for a virtual tour of the significant images, protest signs, and social media posts that have come out of the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Since World War II, African Americans' fight for civil rights, social equality, and equal justice has increasingly unfolded through visual media. The question of Black freedom has been and continues to be put before the public through photos and video images. Americans in the 1960s saw footage of civil rights marches, sit-ins, and boycotts in newspapers and on their nightly news. And in the 21st century, social media and smartphones mean that news organizations no longer control which images of Black protest or suffering circulate widely. Last spring, for example, the nation erupted after a video went viral showing Minneapolis police killing George Floyd. Many have pointed to that resulting images of protest as evidence of something, but the question is what? So we're going to explore the power of Black protest images, past and present, as representations of Black life in the United States and as tools in African Americans' ongoing quest for freedom. A little bit about our professor tonight. Dr. Brenna Greer is an associate professor of history, focusing on race, gender, and culture in the 20th century at Wellesley College. Her first book represented the Black image makers who reimagined African American citizenship, examines the historical circumstances that made the media representation of Black citizenship good business in the post-World War II era. Dr. Greer is currently at work on her second book, which examines the post-war development of Black commercial publishing and its significance within US culture and Black life. And again, the event is sponsored by the Tewksbury Public Library, presented in collaboration with libraries working towards social justice, and specifically the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover and the Wayland Free Public Library. And before we give a big virtual round of applause, I did just forget that regarding the chat and the Q&A, goes without saying, and I'll be monitoring it closely, but just a reminder for folks that we don't want any harassing or threatening language or any profanity. So goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. So all of us on the line, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dr. Greer for joining us here tonight. And Brenna, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I really want to thank you, Robert, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity, particularly now, because this is a topic, I mean, central to my research. What I do is research social movements and visual culture in relationship often to the marketplace. But so this aligns perfectly with my interests and gives me an opportunity to talk about something that my family is sick of hearing me talk about. So I'm also really heartened and appreciative of this initiative, Libraries Working for Social Justice, that when you contacted me, that really meant a lot to me. Libraries obviously have a special place in my heart, and my mother's a librarian and an archivist, and I obviously use them, but particularly public libraries. And having moved to Massachusetts from the Midwest, the free library system here has just been essential to me, both in terms of being a researcher, but also a mother and a community member. So this all has a lot of meaning to me, and I like to give talks that are open to a broader group than just either my students or my peers in academia. So again, thank you. I was thinking about this. I last lectured on this topic in October, and since then there have been, I think about this stuff all the time to some degree, but when I was asked to lecture on this before, it was in response, or it was clearly prompted by the events of last May, and in particular the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And those events had me thinking a lot about the role of protest and the role of protest images, in that instance, video, in Black American struggle for racial equality and for racial justice. But since then, many things have occurred, and we're still in this pandemic, but I've really been thinking about protest and image in relationship to the events of last month, in particular, most specifically, the insurrection that we had. The fact that I can even say that as a historian, that just kind of blows my mind. But so many images came out of this event, this storming of the Capitol, if you will. And I'm just going to flip through some of those images because I think I'm fairly certain that they're going to be iconic as well. I'm going to talk about a lot of iconic images tonight from the Black freedom struggle, but I just want to put these images there to kind of contextualize some of what I'm saying. These, again, are images from January 6th, when supporters of then President Donald Trump marched to the Capitol with the intent of protesting, if not stopping, the certification of the electoral votes that determined Joe Biden's win in the November 3rd election. And I think, most of us have seen a lot of these images, and they're fairly arresting in many ways. And I haven't figured out my thinking along in terms of what these images mean, but they mean something to me in terms of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I think specifically in terms of, I've been thinking about protest images, or I've been thinking about protest images, but then also this had me thinking a lot about the perception of protest and the perception of protesters. And in the Q&A, I would love to, engage this topic if any of you if anything that I say in my talk proper seems appropriate or relevant in that sense, because as I said, I think that this recent events have given us a whole new archive or catalog of protest images that are going to become very central to what historians talk about in years to come. But as I said, my thinking is still very new on this, so I'd be happy to talk about it more after I talk about the subject that I've been asked to talk about. So what I'll do tonight is give a broad history of protest images that emerged in relationship to the Black Freedom Movement, during which I'm also going to discuss the circumstances that produce those images and their significance as I see it, at least. And before I get going, I'm sure that this is fairly obvious, but I'm going to share a lot of images, and I want to, alert you to the fact that some of them might be disturbing or difficult to many of you or some of you, because many depict Black activists' encounters with or opposition to racial hatred. So I just want to put that alert out there. So the first thing that I need to clarify is what I mean by a protest image. And I'll say that for the purposes of this talk in particular, in the context of the Black Freedom Movement, I'm going to define a protest image as a visual that pictures a person or people signaling their opposition to people or power structures that limit their rights or freedoms as outlined in and protected by the Constitution of the United States. And many of our most iconic images of Black activism come out of the civil rights movement, which I'm defining. This is a slide I often use with my students that kind of gives a visual of the popular narrative civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement I'm defining as a series of Southern conflicts between nonviolent Black activists and white segregationists and supremacists that ran roughly from the mid-50s to the late 60s. And this is a period that civil rights historians refer to as the classic or the heroic phase of the Black freedom struggle. And it's not entirely surprising that iconic images come out of this period, because as I argue in my work, the post-World War II civil rights movement was a media movement, in that civil rights activists clearly understood themselves or came to understand themselves as media subjects, and they marshaled and manipulated visual media for their protests, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And so I'm going to go through some of the examples of images, some of the images that I imagine a lot of you have seen, and just to kind of prime you in terms of what was coming out of this moment. So here we have an image that signaled the historic 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. And this is a mother and daughter sitting on the Supreme Court steps immediately after that ruling. And here's a picture many of you may have seen. This is an image of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted after she surrendered herself for her participation in the 1955-1956 Montgomery bus boycott. And an alternative of this scene actually occurred in the New York Times. So, now they're iconic, they've circulated a lot, but at that point in time, this image had a very wide audience. Here's an image that is of the Little Rock Nine, who were 9 teenagers in Little Rock, Arkansas, who integrated Central High School in 1957. And as you can see here, they're under the protection of the National Guard. They go to school for that entire year under the protection of the National Guard, which I'll come back to touch on in a little bit. And here's a fairly familiar scene in which this group is the Greensboro Four, which were 4 Black college students who in 1960 staged a sit-in at the local Woolworth counter and set off a series of sit-ins then through 1960 and 61 at lunch counters throughout the South. And when I'm teaching, I often say to my students, because we live in a very activist time, and I think college is a very activist time in people's lives, but I often ask them to imagine if they would and what it would have been like to be these 4 gentlemen or other college students who made the same move at that point in time. Along those same lines, I'm the mother of a 4-year-old right now. And this image always gets me. I see it as a heartbreaking image. This is 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who was the first and the only African-American child to integrate an all-white elementary school in New Orleans in 1956, which was 6 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. This little girl was supposed to go to school with 6 other children, but those parents, deciding it was too dangerous, actually pulled out. And Ruby Bridges' mother determined that she would go. And she went to school by herself for a full year. A woman from the North, a white woman from the North, was brought in to teach her. And she was under the guard of federal marshals for that entire year. And I just saw on Facebook a post celebrating Ruby Bridges' birthday, and she's in her early 60s, I believe. And so when you think about that in terms of contextualizing just how distant or not distant this event was, I think that's significant. And then here we have an image of Black teenagers in Birmingham, Alabama, who are struggling to stand their ground against the blast from fire hoses that were turned on them at the order of Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor. And these are images that I find that a lot of Americans are very familiar with coming out of Birmingham. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then this also is a very famous image of Martin Luther King Jr. in August of 1963. And here he's handling a crowd of approximately 20,000 that had assembled on the National Mall for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And this is where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this image, this is probably one of my favorite photographs by James Corrales. I think it's stunning, of a 1965 voting rights march, or the 1965 voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery. This is marches on the third attempt to have made it from from Selma to Montgomery to take their demands for voting rights to the state capitol in Montgomery. And then finally, in this series of images that I'm showing you right now, this depicts Black men in Memphis, Tennessee, sanitation workers who were striking for better pay and safer working conditions. And through their protests, as these signs show, they were claiming their civil rights and their human rights in a gendered statement of their manhood, which had special significance, or has special significance when you're thinking about Black men in a civil rights context. And so these images and others like them hold a special place in our public memory, and I think they're emblazoned on our national consciousness. And in fact, in the almost 2 decades that I've been teaching and talking about the Black freedom struggle and the civil rights movement in particular, I've learned that the iconic familiarity of a lot of the images that I've just shown you allow many to feel that they actually know the history of the civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement, despite, as I find out over and over again, that many of them have had little to no experience with or education about the Black freedom movement, at least prior to their lifetimes in terms of my students. So I think there are particular reasons for why civil rights protest images rose to their iconic status. And I want to just talk about that for a little bit. For one, in the post-World War II moment, media technologies were developing and changing in ways that made circulation of images easier, faster, and wider. I mean, certainly not to the extent that they are now, but now we take our image-saturated, media-driven culture for granted. But in the mid-20th century United States, this was a thing becoming. And photographs of civil rights protests didn't have to compete for attention as pretty much all visuals now do. So that when you think about that, the media and image culture of that time period allowed for protest images, which were sensational in their own right, to settle and simmer and therefore stick in people's minds. But I would argue that nothing accounts for the impact and the staying power of civil rights protest images more than the type of protests that they captured, by which I mean specifically nonviolent direct action. And a lot of times people will use that term nonviolence just kind of loosely, but it is a specific type of protest in which it's protesting or resisting or intervening without violence, right? That's the intent. That's the strategy, without violence, but with the intent, as Dr. King explained in his letter from a Birmingham jail, with the intent of creating crisis and tension. And we'll come back to this. So beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56, nonviolence emerged as a central and mainstream civil rights campaign. The bus boycott is often recognized or considered by many people, historians and otherwise, to be the beginning of the civil rights movement as we know it. That or the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So, and that nonviolence materialized in many forms. And here I show this image because you can see nonviolent direct action in this image, even though you see no Black protest, because what this image represents is no Black people on a bus, right? And in fact, 95% of Black Montgomery stayed off the city's buses after Rosa Parks was arrested in 1955. They stayed off the buses for 381 days. I think a lot of people, or a lot of my students, often think that the Montgomery bus boycott was a short action. And in fact, it was over a year. There are also the freedom rides of 1961, and there have been recent documentaries on these, so some of you may be familiar with these. These were integrated campaigns in which Black and white civil rights activists, Southern and Northern, rode buses through the South to challenge the non-enforcement of Supreme Court decisions that desegregated interstate bus travel. And then even children, you saw the picture of Ruby Bridges before, but even children participated in nonviolent campaigns, as was the case in the 1963 Children's Crusade, as it was dubbed by civil rights activists and the media. This is in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is when civil rights leaders organized local school children from elementary to high school to walk out of their classes to protest segregation as part of a larger campaign led by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called Project C, which was about desegregating public accommodations in Birmingham. And then, of course, there's marches. Just many, many marches characterize or define the civil rights era. And so photographs of Black nonviolent protests were new media images for American audiences, and they were made all the more spectacular for their unfamiliarity. And they were dramatic often and infused with tension. And I think this image makes that maybe most evident. This is an image of voting rights activists originating in Selma. This is when they are trying to march to Montgomery. Voting rights activists coming over after they've come over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, facing off with local and state police who are there to arrest, there to stop them from marching. I want to say, well, I'm going to go back to this image actually for a second, because I think it actually speaks better to what I want to talk about. So these images, they are dramatic, but what I want to argue to you is to say that they, while they captured dramas, while they were dramatic, they also captured dramas, and they're carefully staged dramas, which is to say that civil rights activists consciously engineered confrontations that drew media coverage and generated press that advanced their character as much as their cause. And in fact, when going back to the freedom rides, I go back here for a second, many of you may know that civil rights activists in the South started bringing in white Northerners precisely because they understood, one, they wanted their activism and their help and their support, but they understood that the media would follow those white children, white college students, because their lives had more value. So that was part of the strategy in terms of integrating these campaigns as well. So they, drew media coverage and generated press that advanced their character as much as their cause. And their success in doing so was rooted in a fundamental aspect of nonviolent direct action, which was its reliable tendency to provoke white violence, a tendency that produced arguably some of the most compelling images of the civil rights movement. For example, this image of Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine. And the story behind this image is that Eckford was one of the nine, and the agreement was on the first day in 1957, when they were going to integrate the schools, on the first day of school, that the nine of them would meet at the school. But the night before, Daisy Bates, the head of the local NAACP, decided that they should all meet at her home. They met there every day for the rest of the year. But Elizabeth Eckford did not have a phone. Her family did not have a phone. So she showed up to the school by herself and is confronted with this crowd, while the other 8 members of the Little Rock Nine were at Daisy Bates's house. So we'll come back to this image as well. Here, going back to the Freedom Rides, this is a bus that was carrying Freedom Riders that's burning on the side of the highway outside Anniston, Alabama, after white supremacists had slashed the tires, which forced it to stop, and then they boarded the bus and firebombed it. I think this might be an image that many people are familiar with. This is an image of police dogs being sicked on black youth protesting segregation in Birmingham, again in 1963, on the order of Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor. And then here, hoses turned on young protesters, also at the order of Bull Connor in Birmingham. And going back to the sit-ins, you have integrated sit-ins as well. And here you have white spectators, chiding, harassing, and assaulting activists engaged in sit-ins. And then you had the image, I showed you the image of the voting rights activists facing off with the local and state police. Well, this is what happened immediately after that. State and local law enforcement attacked those demonstrators, which included, as you can see here in this photograph, the man who is cowering there, trying to protect his head. That's recently passed Representative John Lewis. So often, and I think too often, people characterize nonviolent protest, or the nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement, as simply a byproduct of the moralistic or religious principles of respectable and spiritual Black folk. And certainly there's overlap in terms of civil rights activists, religious beliefs and philosophies in terms of nonviolent protests. And obviously, Dr. King was schooled in nonviolence and an admirer of Gandhi. And Dr. King had a doctorate in theology. And so certainly that is all coming together in this practice of nonviolent direct action. But the images that I've showed you should also reveal nonviolence to be as much as a strategy as it was a philosophy. It's a strategy meant to, again, as King explained, quote, force the oppressor to commit his brutality openly. And I think nothing speaks to the activist understanding of nonviolence as a strategy more than the nonviolent direct action training workshops, and I put emphasis on training, that were organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And during these workshops, members of SNCC repeatedly assaulted assaulted their fellow activists verbally, but also physically. Right? I find this to be incredible. I find these photographs to be particularly incredible. And these workshops were meant to prepare protesters for what they were likely to encounter in their nonviolent protest, and more importantly, to train them to override the instinct to strike back. So in other words, it was not assumed that nonviolence came naturally. There was training to this approach, to this strategy. And so for this reason, while many view civil rights images of white on Black racial violence that came out of these protests to be scenes of Black passivity or powerlessness, or conversely of white power, I actually view them as media events in which Black protesters manipulated racists into acting in ways that elevated African Americans as upright citizens, and through a visual juxtaposition, cast white racists and Jim Crow as the truly uncivilized and disturbing element in American society. For the greater American public and an international audience, photographs like these were proof of large, jagged, and bloody rips in the fabric of American democracy. And they were an indictment on the entire nation. And it's important when thinking about the 1950s and early 60s, especially, to put this in a Cold War context. You know, the United States comes out of World War II as the leader of the free world, and countries all over the globe are pointing to the United States treatment of African Americans to criticize, to indict. The United States, particularly the Soviet Union, often points to the United States treatment of its Black citizens to make the argument of communism's superiority over the United States and its democracy and capitalism. Right? And so images like this are an indictment on the entire nation. And as such, they're also purchased. They also have purchased for African Americans. So I'm going to explain that. Using these scenes that came out of Birmingham in 1963, in the spring of 1963. These scenes awoke something in President John F. Kennedy, who to that point had been moderate to recalcitrant, actually, on civil rights issues. And in a private meeting at the White House, he stated that in particular, the photograph of a police dog lunging at teenager Walter Gaston, quote, made him sick. And he lamented about what those images would do, quote, for our image abroad. And then shortly after that, he delivered what is a historic televised speech, unprecedented, televised speech to the nation, in which he said, quote, "Who among us would be content with counsels of patience and delay? Now is the time. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise." And within a year, President Lyndon Johnson had leveraged the sentiments Kennedy expressed in that televised speech, as well as he leveraged Kennedy's assassination to push the Civil Rights Act through Congress. He framed it in terms of honoring Kennedy's wishes. And then in March 1965, as I've already referenced, there are this campaign coming out of Selma on behalf of voting rights, which tells you this is following the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 hardly makes, Black freedom and equality and civil rights a done issue. And in fact, that's largely because of the challenges or the hurdles to their being able to vote. And so these images of state and local police attacking Black protesters who were marching for voters' rights galvanized both federal and public support. And this event, March 7th, 1965, is dubbed Bloody Sunday. And the images that emerged from the conflict were widely credited with securing passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, you had President Lyndon B. Johnson, going on television and speaking to the horror of those images and what it meant in terms of who Americans were and what the nation stood for. And so, in other words, images of nonviolent Black protests were hugely significant in their power to bring about the legislation that was crucial to Black Americans' ability to experience, or at least approach, first-class citizenship. Additionally, they were, I think, significant record of African Americans' strategic co-optation of the media and command over white supremacists. That said, in looking over the past and in terms of my experiences in the classroom, I see these nonviolent protest images as being powerful in another way that I actually find troubling. Because an enduring legacy of the images that came out of the civil rights period, out of nonviolent direct action, is their elevation of what some people refer to as polite protest. And the polite protester, perhaps best embodied by the popular image of Rosa Parks, the popular idea. And so I give you this image as an example. This is Rosa Parks' this is the most famous, most reproduced image of Rosa Parks, and it's actually one of the most reproduced images in US history in terms of a photojournalistic image. And it was taken on December 21st, 1956. And that's the day that African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama ended their boycott of the city buses. And many people mistake or unconsciously assume this photograph is record of the moment that or the moment before Parks was arrested in December of 1955, a year earlier, despite the improbability that there would have been a photographer on the scene, right? This actually isn't the happy accident of a photographer on the right, in the right place at the right time. It's actually this moment and the picture are both 100% staged. That morning of December 21st, 1956, reporters had tracked down Parks at her apartment in the Cleveland Court Projects and convinced her to come downtown where, as she put it, they had her get on and off buses so they could take pictures. And these reporters had come seeking Rosa Parks while pretty much everyone else was following Dr. King and his fellow ministers as they got on buses. So Parks is very purposely seated in front of this white man who was not a random passenger, but rather a United Press International reporter that had been selected to sit behind Parks and play what he himself termed as the sullen white segregationist. And the next week, Time magazine published this image. And Time magazine at the time was the #1 news magazine. And since this image has circulated countless times over in textbooks, newspapers, museum exhibits, and even advertisements. When Rosa Parks passed in 2005, the company Apple actually put this image in the iPod silhouette kind of format on its website, on the homepage of its website. It circulated so much to the extent that Rosa Parks referred to it as her historical badge of honor. She dubbed it her quote unquote symbol shot. And as an image of quiet and prim femininity, the photograph, I think, works symbiotically with the popular conception of Parks as this work-weary seamstress whose tired feet compelled her to break character and single-handedly launch the modern Black freedom movement, or the modern civil rights movement, I should say, right? And so it presents her as that narrative presents her as an accidental activist. And it's important to recognize that Parks consciously participated in the making of this image, which completely belied her rebellious nature and her established her identity as an established activist. Rosa Parks was a lifelong activist and fairly radical in her activism, which is something I'd be happy to expand on more if asked. And she did this, she facilitated this image of herself because at the time it was politically expedient to do so. But as her most famous image of one of the most famous civil rights figures, the contrived image helped popularize and glorify polite protest as good and respectable Black protest, and to glorify or elevate this image of Blackness, which becomes courageous but also benign, I think, elevated that image of Blackness and Black protest. And then after Montgomery, SNCC further institutionalized this vision of Black protest with photographs and publicity that it distributed through the organization's communications department. And I want to draw attention to that again, right? There's strategy, there's an infrastructure that's going behind the protest, and then also the publicity and the promotion of these protests and in the representation of these protests. And so I would argue, or I have argued, that these images like this, become a brand against which all subsequent Black activism has been judged, and often harshly, or is judged. And that was certainly the case with media images generated by African Americans who embraced Black power in the wake of the civil rights movement, so in the later 60s and early 70s, compared to the images of reserved African Americans dressed in their Sunday best, as the press often described nonviolent activists. Black power advocates, most notably the Black Power Party for Self-Defense, projected a site of Black militancy that one scholar, Lee Rayford, argues attacked viewers, right? Visually attacked viewers. And so that take, for instance, this photograph, which is a 1967 photograph of Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. In making this photograph, Newton collaborated with Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver and the white photographer Brent Jones to produce what now is arguably one of the most famous representations of Black power, or at least the Black Panther Party. And they produced this image for the purpose of posters. And just like participants in the civil rights movement, the Panthers carefully engineered an image they believed that would be useful to their purposes of publicizing the organization and its philosophy and programs. But this image of Black protest is the antithesis of the Black activist idea that's presented in the Black symbol shot, and that represents nonviolent protest. The only similarities, right, in these two images is that both Parks and Newton are seated. Otherwise, Newton is pictured separate from white people, brandishing instruments of battle and surrounded by stereotypical symbols of not just Blackness, but Africanness. And again, all of this was very intentional, right? The spear, the zebra print rug. And what's more, Newton is smack dab in the center of the picture, and he doesn't look away. His is an assertive pose that anticipates and even invites confrontation. Another difference between civil rights protest images and the Panthers is that the former assumed and in fact courted a wide mixed audience. By comparison, the Panthers, when they produced this image of the, many people refer to this as the peacock chair image, the Panthers intended the image for a specific and specifically Black audience, namely the local communities they meant to serve. However, given their unprecedented and sensational nature, or the sensational nature of their politics, the Panthers quickly earned a mainstream audience. And it's at this point that the image that they had created got away from them, in my opinion. The Panthers' representation of Black power, along with their commitment to armed self-defense, scared many Americans, including many Black Americans. And this is an image of the Panthers when they went to the Capitol in Sacramento, California, to oppose legislation that was meant to restrict their right to carry arms. You know, I've looked at this photograph tons of times. It's really interesting for me to consider it anew in the wake of the events of January 6th last month. So this image, this scary image, scary for many, contributed to the politics behind it too, contributed to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's classification of the Panthers as, quote, the greatest threat to internal security of the country. And it inspired a coordinated and ultimately successful effort among federal, state, and local officials to suppress the organization. So in contrast to nonviolent direct action, Black power activism produced images of what many clearly considered to be bad and therefore unacceptable protests, which is apparent in the response to Olympians Tommie Smith and John Carlos's raising their fists in the Black Power salute during a medal ceremony in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. The head of the International Olympic Committee deemed their political statement to be, quote, a deliberate and violent breach of the Olympic spirit. And he expelled the two athletes from the Games. And I just want to point out that the same IOC official had not objected to Nazi salutes during the 1936 Games in Berlin, where Jesse Owens won gold medals. So the 1960s saw the advent of another form of Black protest, also widely considered bad and even criminal, which were urban uprisings. Starting with Watts in 1965, which was a protest of Blacks in the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles, that was sparked by a fight between Blacks in the community and the police related to a traffic stop. And then 3 years later, in the spring of 1966, 1968, there were uprisings or riots, we can talk about terminology, that occurred in multiple major US cities following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968. And then again, I remember these very well, in Los Angeles in 1992, after an all-white jury came back with a verdict of not guilty for police officers who had viciously beat Rodney King after a traffic stop. And so I think the Rodney King affair actually anticipated, if not inaugurated, the next phase of the Black freedom movement, or at least struggle. In the post-World War II era, African Americans sought the end of segregation and other Jim Crow humiliations, and they demanded rights, civil rights inherent to their status as American citizens. In the post-civil rights era, economic and criminal justice reform became primary objectives of the Black freedom movement. And now, in the 21st century, police brutality has emerged as a, if not the pressing issue, due to what historian Yamada Taylor has described as, quote, cops' simple inability to stop killing Black people. And for the past decade, protests have occurred in cities all over the United States following police shootings or killings of unarmed, underaged, mentally ill, compliant, indignant, and or innocent African American men, women, and children, including, to name a scant few, Oscar Grant, Reka Boyd, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tanisha Anderson, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Natasha McKenna, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Atiana Jefferson, Lyndon Cameron, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and so on, and so on, and so on. And last May in Minneapolis, as we've already referenced, George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man suspected of passing a fake $20 bill, was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin, who casually kneeled on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, ignoring the incapacitated man's pleas for breath and bystanders' calls to, quote, let him up. The city erupted. My sister actually lives in Minneapolis, and so I had more of a intimate experience with these circumstances than I would like, or I certainly wanted for her. As with previous uprisings or urban uprisings, media images that came out of Minneapolis captured African Americans engaged in multiple forms of protest and expressing a myriad of emotions, from disbelief to rage. And in response, some, including then President Donald Trump, seized on those images of Blacks destroying property or looting to dismiss the protests as delegitimate and label protesters as thugs who were beyond the bounds of justice. In addition to riots, the killing of George Floyd prompted peaceful protests across the nation and around the world, in which large groups, diverse in every sense, gathered under the banner of Black Lives Matter to demand police reform and racial justice. And these demonstrations were unique in their number, size, reach, and longevity, as well as in the vast participation of non-Blacks. And from those protests emerged a new set of compelling visuals that define the current Black freedom movement, which I am for now referring to as Black Lives Matter images. And here's a sampling of those images that I'll go through. This is in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's killing. I'm struck by the number of children that are brought into the images of the protests this past summer. Case in point. So arguably, because the pandemic had a great many of us confined to our homes, these images had a heightened place in our visual sphere in their exposure of it as exposure and for prompting a wide and growing anti-racism movement. But I have questions about the power of these images, or the power that these images actually have, because they can't help but perform and be perceived differently from Black freedom movement protest images of the past, which I can go into more in terms of what I think why that is. But for one, unlike the early years of the civil rights era, the American public is thoroughly accustomed to spectacular visuals. And it's the rare media image now that is not quickly replaced by one that's even more captivating. A second concern I have is that I fear that Black Lives Matter images are often valued more as visuals than as useful tools in the fight for Black freedom, or as documents of the lack of Black freedom. In particular, I've become troubled by the currency that images of Black protest and Black pain and anguish seem to have as artistic expressions of emotion in ways that might distract from the circumstances that are behind those emotions. And this isn't a new phenomenon, but present day technologies have really amplified it. In particular, social media has transformed the public's relationship to and the role of protest images. And on platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, Black Lives Matter images have become a shorthand for signaling one's politics, to indicate where one stands on racism and the value of Black lives. And I think, and I'm certainly guilty of this, I'm sure, I think they often perform as avatars for the activist self that we imagine ourselves to be or want to be, or as symbols of the courage we want others to know that we admire, if not possess. And in the digital age, trading these images, and that's sometimes what I feel like is happening on my Facebook feed, trading these images has become a form of political and performative activism, which I think too often stands in the way of real activism, for lack of a better word, the activism that's necessary, or action, I guess I should say. And what's more, I think the symbolic utility has made these images so ubiquitous as to numb viewers to their disturbing and distressing content, not to mention their function as a call to action. And that this is so helps explain, I believe, why the murder of George Floyd had the effect that it did. Because I think that the 8 minutes and 46-minute video of Floyd's futile campaign for his life was a protest image that was so disturbing and so distressing that many of us determined that we never, ever want to see anything like it again. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Greer. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box, and I would encourage those who are with us to get some more questions into that Q&A box, and we'll go for another 10 minutes or so. First question comes from Martha. The images you are showing are very impactful. How do you compare the influence of these photos from videos today? And she asked this earlier in your presentation, but you can still speak to it.
Sure. Well, I hope I'm understanding this correctly. It's some of what I was saying right at the end. I think that because of the media technologies that we have right now, and how the fact that most people have phones, and therefore there's always somebody on the scene, right, gives us images that are incredible, but for all sorts of reasons, just how we've developed as an image culture and people in an image culture. I think that while the images have in many ways become more compelling, sometimes more sensational, sometimes more horrifying, they don't have the same impact. I mean, by virtue of the fact that I can talk about an insurrection that happened a month and a half ago, and it's incredible, and people understand that, and people still talk about it that way, but we've largely moved on. right? Despite having all the visual evidence, despite having just gone through an impeachment trial where they've given a lot more visual evidence of what happened. So I just think that we've become somewhat numb and always kind of seeking the next visual. And so it's weird. It's almost like the content or the composition doesn't matter anymore, which obviously isn't true, but because it's so quickly considered and then digested and moved on. So so I think there's a primacy and an amateurist to a lot of these videos because of who's taking them. Like most of the images that I showed you from the civil rights movement, those are photographers, trained in getting photojournalistic images. But so they're compelling in a lot of ways in terms of just composition and content, but and compelling because they didn't have a lot of competition. These days, it's hard for any image to break through. That's, like I said, I think that's why that Floyd video did have the impact that it did.
Ada wants to know, can you expand upon Rosa Parks' activism? Also, was she trained for this mission, or were there others considered for this role?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's a long story, and I would point you to a book by Daniel McGuire and another book by Jean Theo Harris. But Rosa Parks was formalizing her activism in the 1930s. She organized on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys, who were 9 Black teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women. She and her husband held organizing meetings at their home. She performed as the lookout for those meetings. They were armed meetings during the early 1940s. She joined the local NAACP, only the 3rd woman to do so. In that role, she traveled around the state by herself, gathering information about white on Black brutality. In particular, she was a public, vocal supporter of Black women who were the victims of sexual abuse, which is activism that she carried out late into her life. She became the secretary for the Alabama State NAACP. She spoke at conventions. She went to the Highlander Folk School, which was a leadership training school. So all of this had happened before her arrest. And so some people will ask me if she was a plant, like the NAACP planted her on the bus to do what she did. That's not what happened. She was an NAACP member. But if you know her back history, you know that the decision that she made wasn't breaking character. She wasn't an accidental activist. She was entirely inclined to make that choice, and in fact had done so in the past. She'd had run-ins with this very same bus driver in the past. There are many other women who made the same stand that she did before she did. Many of them were jailed, many of them were beaten, fined. One woman's daughter, 16-year-old daughter, was taken by a police officer and raped as reprisal for her trying to get justice in terms of being discriminated. There's no doubt that Rosa Parks was chosen for her demeanor, her respectability demeanor, which was able to offset that activist element, which was actually did run afoul of current gender or contemporary gender and race politics. And other women who came before her were deemed to be too young, too Black, too dark, too poor. There were issues with people in their family, maybe being alcoholics. So you can see when I talk about the civil rights movement being a series of media events, you can see that African Americans understood the image politics, or at least believed that image politics were really central in terms of their ability to advance their cause. So, and I won't go into it now, but Rosa Parks also has much activism after the Montgomery bus boycott.
Patricia asks, are you saying that the images which has sparked Black Lives Matter movements did not create a healthy response to this problem, which I myself have been fighting since the 60s?
Okay, let me see if I understand. The images, so like police brutality images, obviously, I don't know if she can clarify. Images that spark Black Lives Matter. It's not that I don't think that they're, I think that having information is always good. As a historian, any type of documentary evidence can be helpful. It depends on what people are going to do with it. And I think like very recently, within the last decade, and even within the last 5 years, one, I think we are just like flooded with this imagery because everybody has phones, right? It's not that suddenly more incidents of racism are happening or brutality, right? It's just everybody has phones, everything is recorded. And I find in my circle of friends and like scholarly friends that the images become something that just fuel kind of fatigue and rage in us, but also probably inaction to a degree. Like we all know we're righteously indignant but it creates this kind of fatigue and cynicism in a way that I think can be, for people of color, very unhealthy psychically and emotionally. But then also, just more broadly speaking, we can dwell on the images as opposed to the injustice.
Amy says that the transition of media images into art is a step in the process of iconization. Consider, for example, some of the most iconic images from the Vietnam War, for example, Napalm Girl. Does this detract from their power, or rather make these images intractable part of American culture and therefore less easy to ignore?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? One of the things, like all the covers that I showed you, I have, right? One, I have them because of what I study, but I also have them because some of them are artists that I really admire, Kadir Nelson, for one. And it's absolutely oftentimes that artist renditions or artist imagery is what moves something towards iconic status. I just don't think that having an iconic status is always the best thing, right? I mean, there are many images that are iconic. And like I said, that Rosa Parks image, I've been battling the effects of that image for 2 decades now in terms of how it helps people think about Rosa Parks. Certainly, everything that they think about in terms of what she deserves and her courage and memorializing her, totally deserved. But in terms of what it allows people not to know, which are very useful histories, what it encourages them not to know or encourages them to think that they know, I think is really problematic, precisely in terms of us having information that we need now to be able to figure out how to organize, to be able to figure out what is politically expedient, to figure out whether or not we should be concerned with image politics. So I just think, art definitely moves things towards iconic status and makes it easier, or makes it harder for us to ignore. I don't know that that's necessarily always non-problematic or unproblematic.
Final question goes to Linda. You talked mostly about photographic images. Have you explored any paintings or sculptures?
Yeah, I used to, before I started studying the civil rights movement, I studied a lot more in the Harlem Renaissance era in the 1930s. And so I paid a lot more attention to like art, in that sense, sculptures and paintings, and particularly in terms of a more educated elite trying to promote particular images of what they often referred to as the new Negro at that point in time. I haven't done because I moved away from that, I don't feel that I should, make any grand statements or arguments about that. I also have not spent as much time looking at the Black arts movement, but I spent a lot of time looking at Black Panther art, particularly Emory Douglas. And that is art that absolutely functioned as a information vehicle. And so I use that a lot in the classroom in that sense. But so, yeah, my focus has largely been either video or photography. And so I wouldn't want to front any other. I wouldn't want to front that I have knowledge or deep thoughts beyond that.
Sharon got one last question under the wire. Sharon says, given our current society's saturation of these ubiquitous images, what do you believe would be useful images to make progress?
Yeah, I think images that make people see regimes of representation or regimes of power. And by which I mean, like, I'm trying to think of an example. An image that might take something that we're so used to seeing, but do something to it that makes it like, I can't remember the man's name. There's an artist who really messes with images of like Absolute vodka bottles, or he has the picture of an African-American man's head shaved and you just see the face from here. And there's a Nike swoosh sign of the hair, shaved into it. Things that make you like think like, whoa, that there's a commentary there about, basketball and capitalism and slavery all coming together, that just, they take things that we're so used to seeing and mash them up in a way that it kind of explodes things in a way that we have to stop and try and figure things out. And that makes people stop, right? Because you're seeing something anew. I think those are the images that generally, at least for me personally, get through in a way that's not like, oh yeah, I've seen one of those. So that's an example that I think might be useful.
So Dr. Breer, do you have any last words for the group before we wrap up?
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much. And the fact that you are, participating in things like this for Black History Month. For me as an African-American woman, African-American historian who specializes in African-American history, Black History Month can be really troubling to me sometimes in the way that it's often observed, which is just kind of high level, same set of celebrity figures. And so to have a series of so many different conversations going on, I just think does Black history, does it justice it deserves as a complex part of U.S. history. So I really appreciate it. And I thank you all for joining this conversation.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you for giving us your expertise and for giving ourselves an hour of your time, and looking forward to finishing our Black History Month series strong here in Tewksbury. And I'd also note that we are committed to a year-long initiative with social justice and equity, inclusion, and diversity. So, certainly we're focused on Black History Month this month, but we're not forgetting about it when the calendar turns to March. So, but trust me, we're in this for the long haul. And so, want to thank everyone. Want to thank Wayland. Want to thank North Andover. Want to thank Tewksbury. Thank you all so much. Look for that email tomorrow morning, and I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.